Hello, dear prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for June the 14th, 2021. We're getting right along in June. Um, Hope you're doing well this day. So let's look at our text for today. We have Deuteronomy 19, Psalm 106, Isaiah 46, and then finally Revelation 16. So let's jump right on in with Deuteronomy 19. Remember that these are reiterating. Moses is reiterating a lot of what we have found previously in books like Leviticus and Numbers and many of these texts in Deuteronomy, except that in Deuteronomy, they're in the context of exhortation. Again, this is Moses' last opportunity to exhort the Israelites as they go into the promised land and as they get prepared to live as God's covenant people in that land of their inheritance, the land flowing with milk and honey. And so we want to read these in the context of exhortation. So, for instance, this text in Deuteronomy 19 deals with cities of refuge, which is something that have been detailed previously in the book of Numbers 35 specifically. Remember that the Levites had no tribal allotment, so they were given these Levitical cities, and 6 of those Levitical cities were designated as cities of refuge. So we see this specifically again in Numbers 35. Cities of refuge, again, were safe havens for those who accidentally took an innocent life, and they could go that unintentional uh, death or unintentional killer could then flee to these cities of refuge. No place of refuge for those who committed intentional murder. So these texts here in Deuteronomy 19 are specifically to protect the legal system of the Israelites as they go in, and they highlight, I think, something of the justice of God. So, for instance, the idea that you need more than you need to have the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses for a matter to be confirmed. So, again, protecting justice within the land. The cities of refuge have that same purpose. And then, if you do bring an accusation, and the last part of this text, if you do bring an accusation and it proves to be false, then you receive the same punishment that would have been given to the person you were accusing, which I think would have the appropriate effect of um, lessening the number of false accusations in a community of faith. Perhaps, and I think I've suggested this before when we were looking at this in Leviticus, that this would be something that perhaps should be applied in our judicial system today, and might have some beneficial effects on our judicial system. But anyway, that's Deuteronomy 19. Again, uh, all this though in the context of Moses exhorting the people. So let's move on then to Psalm 106. So Psalm 106 has some similarities to Psalm 105 in that it is reflecting upon the actions of God on behalf of his people and reflecting upon something of the history of Israel in its relationship with God, particularly Israel's rebellion against God in this case. So it's reflecting on, for instance, um, things like the golden calf episode, the events at Baal Peor, and so on and so forth, where Israel was rebelling against God. Now, why is the author reflecting in that way? Well, he's reflecting in that way because I think Psalm 106, which, by the way, is the last of the Psalms before we get to book 5. So this is the last of the Psalms in book 4 of the Psalter. This is a psalm, I think, written from the context of the exile. And we see, for instance, that in verse 47, the very end of the psalm before we get to the benediction. So verse 48 is probably a benediction added later to kind of separate it from, to conclude book 4 of the Psalms. So the last verse of Psalm 106 was probably a psalm that, the last verse, I'm sorry, was probably verse 47. And notice what it talks about. Gather us from among the nations, give thanks to your holy name. So this idea of being gathered from the nations seems like it's reflecting upon the fact that they have been scattered to the nations. So why does he reflect upon these instances where Israel has sinned in the past? Well, one thing he's doing, he's identifying with those sins. So look at verse 6, for instance. We have sinned like our fathers. We have committed iniquity. We have behaved wickedly. So there's that kind of identification with the previous generations, and asking for forgiveness, which is similar sins had sent them into exile, right? And so they are identifying with those previous generations, asking for forgiveness for this current generation. And the reason to bring up these previous sins ultimately, I think, is to show that God has acted in behalf of his people in the past with compassion, and now he is acting. He's asking that God will be compassionate once again. So that's Psalm 106. That moves on to Isaiah 46. Isaiah 46 is a text that is kind of the culmination of some of what Isaiah has been talking about in Isaiah 40 through 48. So you remember the themes in Isaiah 40 through 48 were themes such as the futility of idolatry, the uniqueness of God, monotheism, celebration of those things, and of course, if Israel is in fact in exile as they're reading this, this would be a polemic against those false gods where they found themselves in these foreign lands, and they would also be ultimately a reaffirmation of the oneness of Yahweh and the uniqueness of Yahweh and the fact that he is the one and the only one God. So for instance, in verse 9, for I'm God and there's no other, I'm God and there's no one like me. This is also using, it's a unique polemic, and again, a polemic is just an argument for purity of the faith, a polemic against the Babylonian idols here in verse 1 and following of chapter 46. There's in the ancient context, and especially in Mesopotamia, they'd have these processions of gods moving from one place to another in parades, and they'd be carted around. These idols would be carted around, and it's almost as if the beasts that are carrying these idols are more real and more living than the idols themselves. So there's kind of a tongue-in-cheek indictment of the idols as being dead objects of wood and stone here in chapter 46. But again, there's that reaffirmation of God's oneness, his uniqueness, and also that no one can thwart his purposes, which would be a great comfort to those people in exile, or even in Isaiah's audience as they're facing the Assyrian onslaught of the 8th century. And that brings us to Revelation 16. So Revelation 16 is kind of the culmination of all the judgments that we've seen. So remember, there's those series of 7 judgments. So we had the 7 seals, we had the 7 trumpets, and then we have the 7 bowls. One interesting thing to do when comparing these is to actually compare them. Compare and contrast these bowls as opposed to the trumpets, as opposed to the seals, and you'll notice a couple of differences. Number one, you'll notice that there is no interlude. So, for instance, between the 6th and 7th seal and between the 6th and 7th trumpet, there was always this interlude, which injected something of a delay between the 6th judgment and the culminating judgment of those seals and trumpets. Nothing like that here. This is a symbol that the end has in fact come. It is done. Verse 17. The end is ultimately here at this point in this particular vision. You'll also notice that there are, just like with the previous judgments, there are these comparisons to Old Testament judgments, particularly in the Exodus. Um, and you have the first four trumpets, for instance, inflicting, uh, and the first four bowls inflicting judgment on the same um, arenas as well. So earth, sea, rivers, springs, and sun, all experiencing judgment. But this one is kind of the culminating one. Because whereas, for instance, the trumpet judgments were only limited to 1/3 of the sphere of the each sphere, this is complete judgment, and this complete judgment um, is ultimately going to bring everything to an end before we get to the great judgment seat itself. So. Marking an end of history, I guess you could say. So, what is the message to the church in light of that? Well, the message is what we find in verse 15, which is a reiteration, by the way, of something that we found in some of the letters of the churches, Revelation 3:3 specifically, that Jesus is coming like a thief, blesses one who stays awake and keeps his clothes so that he will not walk about naked and men will not see his shame. In other words, the message to the church during this time is, we don't know when this will occur. We know it will occur, and we know ultimately that we need to be prepared, vigilant, and expectant. And that's a message, by the way, you see a lot with these eschatological visions. Is that the purpose is to Jesus himself shows us a lot in the Gospels when he talks about end times types of things. That you need to be prepared, vigilant, and expectant. And that's a good message, I think, for us today as a church as well. So we will get to some interesting, even more interesting visions here in chapters 17 and following in Revelation as we get to the end of the book of Revelation in coming days. So I'm looking forward to those. But I hope you have a great rest of the day on this day, June the 14th, 2021.